This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
It gives me genuinely great pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Caspar Meyer from the Department of History, Classics and Archaeology at Birkbeck College, University of London, my dear colleague, who is a classical archaeologist who recently brought out his book with Oxford University Press, Greco-Scythian Art and the Birth of Eurasia, from classical antiquity to Russian modernity, which came out in 2013. Now, in the last few years, Caspar has been, through his practice as a classical archaeologist, getting involved with the thorny scholarly area of sexuality in ancient Greece, and that it's very much a work in progress, and that is the subject of his paper tonight, called Sensuous Objects, Writing the History of Sexuality from Ancient Art. Caspar.
Good, so thank you very much and thanks for the invitation. So I start off with a little bit of a proviso or apologetics. I should say that, confess that only a few years ago, the very idea of me presenting a paper in a history of sexuality seminar would have been inconceivable. History of sexuality simply wasn't something that I had envisaged doing as a student of Greek archaeology. That the subject wasn't considered relevant to my field partly is down to the empiricist ethos I had come to share with my teachers, but fundamentally reflects long-standing tensions within the discipline, which erupted in the 1980s in the partisan and often acrimonious debate surrounding the so-called Great Divide in archaeology. Broadly speaking, and I'm obviously exaggerating here for the sake of illustration, the discipline was split between those to whom classical archaeology was nothing if not art history, and the new cohort of processualists to whom the sub-branch was like any other field of historical archaeology or anthropology. Simply put, archaeologists of Greece and Rome studied either the iconography and artistic production of images or the contexts of consumption and display. The two aspects hardly ever intersected. Either you looked at isolated objects in a museum, trying to discover what their formal attributes might reveal about their authorship and meaning, or you sorted finds from fieldwork into contextual assemblages and sort of cultural complexes. Although this great divide is now considered somewhat a thing of the past, some key issues remain unresolved. They are brought out by the hermeneutic uncertainties arising from the study of figured monuments. Statues and painted pottery make up a significant part of the material legacy of classical antiquity, yet under the methodological antinomies I just outlined, scholarly integrity demands that you look at them either in terms of their function, how was that pot used, or with regard to their symbolism, what does the drawing on that pot mean? If we get too hooked up on with theoretical questions, it's easy to forget what the visual material in this blind spot between functional and symbolic approaches actually looks like. Over the past decade, the discipline has had no shortage of attempts to bridge that gap with concepts borrowed from anthropology, the works by Alfred Gell, Hans Belting, and so on, and others, examining how the material thing can entangle its viewers and abduct their agency. But all too often such attempts, modelled as they are on situations beyond the discipline's primary evidence, create a disjuncture between the nature of the material and the theoretical frameworks applied to it, substituting for the historical contexts of classical antiquity generic scenarios that could have been encountered supposedly everywhere by anyone. What I'm trying to achieve with this historiographical introduction is to explain how history of sexuality has become relevant to someone who admittedly has read a lot more about the so-called Berlin painter, a skilled but anonymous red figure vase painter active in the early 5th century BC, and actually you have a sample there on the screen by him. So it was read rather more about the Berlin painter than about Foucault or even the sexual mores of the ancient Athenians. The material legacy of classical Athens consists of objects that relate to functional and practical concerns, but accomplish their cultural work fundamentally through the presence of figural renderings that exceed the domains of function and pragmatics. We can look at statues and pottery through the relationships of patronage, production, technology, and so forth, but those relationships alone won't explain the forms the objects ultimately took, and why the design of so many of them so obviously relates to the sexual experiences and constitution of their contemporary viewers. How can I pursue the contextual aspect of my inquiry into the lives of objects without compromising methodological consistency? How can I set apart the morphological distinctions of my archaeological training from the visual discriminations upon which ancient societies were built? And how are we to explain what we see in ancient art in terms of how its ancient audiences perceived it or might have perceived it? These were the sort of questions at the front of my mind when I discovered, thanks to Birkbeck and the wonderful colleagues I have there, that Greek art has attracted a vast literature among scholars on a very different trajectory. Scholars who have read a lot more about Foucault and ancient sex than about the contexts and cultural representations of classical art. Though not directly implicated in the polarities of this great divide debate, this scholarship presents related possibilities and limitations. It dealt with images that spoke to ancient experiences, but in my eyes had failed to reconcile. So that scholarship dealt with images that spoke to ancient experiences, but in my eyes had failed to reconcile what modern viewers can see in those images reliably with the opportunities for historical explanation they afford. So what I want to do today is firstly to highlight where and why history of sexuality has, in my view, gone wrong in its engagement with ancient art, and secondly, outline an alternative approach, one in which questions relating to representations of sex are always bound up with a broader set of questions relating to phenomenology, materialization, and the duration of sensory experience. To hone in on previous work, let me start with a recent surge of studies on images on pederasty on Athenian painted pottery. The two items I'm highlighting here, images of ancient Greek pederasty by Andrew Lear and Eva Cantarella, and the near monographic article on Vase World by Holt Parker, are only the two most ambitious examples of treatments which disagree in the detail of what they argue, but share many key premises in how they approach the material. This approach is embodied in the impressive catalogues of pederastic images on which these studies pride themselves. Each version of this proliferating archive seeks to outdo its predecessor with a greater range of images of men and boys from an even greater range of museum collection. If one thing is beyond doubt, it's the steadfast devotion by sweat on the brows that has gone into the task of gathering this material. The discursive motives of this endeavour are clear too, as Holt Parker has pointed out. Each attempt at defining the limiting factors of ancient sexual practice on the basis of images is countered with another selection of images apparently demonstrating a practice previously considered inadmissible. So, if the orthodoxy says, as it had done since Kenneth Dover's groundbreaking work on Greek homosexuality, that same-sex relations had to be age differential and had to protect the honor of the boy in order to be socially condoned, you can be sure that some images will contravene the orthodoxy. For instance, Charles Huppertz argued on the basis of a small number of vases depicting same-sex couples of equal age engaging in penetrative intercourse that pederasty wasn't the only form. I quote here, pederasty wasn't the only form of homosexual practice in 6th century Athens, and that, quote, other forms of sexual practice than the intercrural were practiced. In a similar vein, Keith de Vries was the first of a number of scholars to point out that some vase paintings violated the supposed norm of the decorously indifferent boy by showing him responding with excitement to the advances of his older suitor. He argued that the wrist-grasping gesture conventionally associated with boys was not only ineffectual as a defensive measure, as it leaves the genitals exposed to the suitor's other hand, it could in fact denote the opposite, an invitation to engage in intimacy. Of course, it has become obligatory to stress that vase images cannot be taken for snapshots of what went on in ancient life. But when scholarship on ancient sex gets down to converting ancient images into historical description, we find ourselves more often than not in a situation where one image has to be judged more realistic than another, or one set of images more representative than another. Although they disagree on what the images tell us about ancient sexual practices, they take for granted that the relationship between representation and the truth of visible sexual practice is what really matters. We hear nothing specific about the objects on which the images appear, or about the interactive settings in which the objects were used. If context is at all mentioned, we are offered sort of a perfunctory synopsis of what the textual sources have to say about the symposium, the all-male drinking parties of which the images were part. Without consideration of the objects bodying forth the images, the expanding catalogues of pederastic vase paintings seem to me a classic case of false empiricism, phenomena being forced to testify on questions to which they bear little epistemological relation. The problem with recent work on Greek sexuality is that the evidence of pictures is often implicitly deployed to counter the Foucauldian take on ancient sexuality, without realizing that the Foucauldian paradigm was itself already grounded in evidence derived from vase images. So to untangle this circularity, we need to revert first to Foucault and then to Dover. As is well known, Greek antiquity provided in the second volume of Foucault's History of Sexuality the critical case of otherness to substantiate his broader claims set out in volume 1, that the modern habit of identifying individuals with a sexual type is contingent on specific styles of psychiatric reasoning that had crystallized in the 19th century. The Greeks were able to act as a starting point for this genealogical exploration because their experience of what the self as a desiring subject was apparently structured around discourses of status rather than gender. So in contrast to modern norms, the distinction between hetero and homosexual inclinations was, according to Foucault, not subject to consistent approbation or condemnation as long as the preferred act of sexual satisfaction was not perceived to jeopardize the obliging masculine ideal of self-sufficiency in civic and economic affairs. To put it plainly, a freeborn citizen was free to gratify his sexual appetites with whomever he wished, as long as bodily gratification did not require him or a fellow citizen to assume a submissive position by being penetrative. How Foucault had arrived at this rule of hierarchical penetrability has been the source of some debate in recent years. Its origins in the ancient textual tradition are not at all clear. Although the Greek sources relate to sex frequently, the precise technicalities of genital intercourse remain shrouded in innuendo. Reticence towards unspeakable deeds is as evident in Athenian comedy as it is in law court speeches and in philosophical dialogues. In spite of the marked partiality of Athenian humor in Athenian humor for profanities. Anyone who revisits the original sources after reading Foucault will be struck by the interpretive leap he accomplished, a leap all the more impressive in view of his acknowledged lack of training in the classics. So how did he succeed in explaining the Platonic love of the classical tradition in terms of a clear set of rules about penetration? The most pointed response to this problem comes from James Davidson's 2001 analysis in Past and Present of the links between Foucault's work to that of Kenneth Dover, the eminent British classicist best known for his 1978 Greek homosexuality. Dover established the key tenet of Foucault's work by arguing that the same-sex relations that met with approval in ancient Athens involved an older lover, the Erastes, pursuing an adolescent beloved, Eromenos, whereas men who continued to assume the role of passive beloved into their maturity were likely to be viewed with suspicion and ridicule. Foucault acknowledged his debt in a newspaper review of Dover's book, as well as numerous references in his History of Sexuality. If the debt is clear, Davidson's critique misses an important point. Whenever he sets out to show why Dover reduced love to asymmetrical penetration and why Foucault adopted the same logic, Davidson resorts to factors of circumstance. So homophobia, post-war anti-inhibitionism, class anxieties, even anti-Semitism. At one point, Davidson even implies that the validity of the Dover-Foucault orthodoxy, as it has come to be known, was a priori dubious, as it was not based on any new evidence, a claim that is admissible only if we discount the numerous vase paintings which Dover introduced to argue his point. If not exactly new, the evidence from Greek painted pottery was certainly newly discovered at the time, owing to the formation of classical archaeology as an independent university subject. Thanks to synthetic works published by the preceding generation of English-speaking classical archaeologists, it had become possible for linguists like Dover to complement their works with arguments from visual evidence, even if they hadn't been trained in the auxiliary discipline. The pot paintings filled a problematic gap in the literary sources between the lyric poetry of the archaic period and the law court speeches and the Socratic dialogues of the 4th century BC. Whereas the earlier poems offer a glimpse of the praise of handsome boys that was customary in symposia, the late classical sources provide normative analyses of erotic relationships between freeborn men, strongly disapproving of commercial ones and at least admonitory about those centered on physical attraction. Of course, none of these texts details unambiguously what acts any given relationship entailed. To Dover, this reticence about eros was always a euphemism for sex, whose truth the pots conveniently illustrated. The modern corpus upon which Dover's active-passive model of sex rests goes itself back to the compositional classification of so-called courtship scenes between male couples, which was undertaken in 1947 by the Oxford pottery doyen John Beazley. He divided the scene, as you can see here, into 3 types. Type A, with the older Erastes in the so-called up and down position, kneeling slightly to caress the face of the younger Eromenos with one hand, while reaching out to his genitals with the other. And then type B, with the suitor offering a present to the beloved, commonly in the form of hair, stocks, fighting cocks, or flowers, musical instruments, and so on. And then type C, in which lover and beloved are in physical contact, performing what is now generally known as intercrural or interfemoral sex. From this classification, Dover deduced the behavioral rules I mentioned earlier, protecting the boy's honor. And you have it here in his book, reference to pots. They concentrate, especially in a chapter there, on Aeschines' Timarchos, so a law court speech, which he illustrated with the pots. So the protecting the boy's honors and these behavioral rules are that the Greek homosexuality was age differential. The boy played hard to get, and unlike women, they weren't penetrated and weren't meant to enjoy intercourse. Although the scholarship on ancient sexuality published in the wake of Foucault refers frequently to vases, the full dependence of his argument on the material legacy of antiquity has remained unexamined. Given that Foucault apparently never saw the need to concern himself with the problems which such evidence poses, the weakness, if it is considered one, may be felt to introduce one of those red herrings already abounding in critiques of his work. Feminists have faulted Foucault for excluding women as sexual subjects from his discussion, even though the classical period sources, whatever they might have to say about women's desires, lacked the female voices that could sustain the genealogical analysis of modern sexuality, which Foucault had set out to undertake. Other scholars, designated essentialists or gay rights advocates, criticized Foucault for downplaying the emotional bonds of attraction and love which must have existed in antiquity as in any other period between partners of whatever sex, even though Foucault had stressed time and again that the protocols of Greek sexuality, Greek ethics distilled from the works of Greek moralists, I quote, should not lead us to draw hasty conclusions either about the sexual behaviors of the Greeks or about the details of their tastes. So where Foucault had spoken in a very nuanced way of internalized dispositions, some commentators were too quick to assume that these dispositions also corresponded to external power relations. They risked mistaking Foucault's specific argument about the cultural basis of sexuality for a general argument about the cultural basis of sexual attraction or the sexual proclivities of the Greeks. There is a clear distinction to be drawn between the book we wish Foucault had written and the book he had wanted to write. Nevertheless, we also need to concede that some aspects of his work on Greek sexuality undermine the coherence of his own project. And foremost among these is the symbolic isomorphism which he posited in his Greek ethics of desire between political hegemony and phallic domination as penetrator. Whereas previous critics have focused on the emotional reduction his active-passive model implies, I am much more concerned by the suggestion that the visible reality of Greek sexual practice does matter to his genealogy of discourses. Even the slightest suggestion to this effect threatens to transform his investigation into an unstable hybrid, concentrating neither reliably on the discursive construction of desire nor on the complete structure of Greek gender relations. If we contemplate the coherence of his presentation rather than the substance of his argument, then many of the objections which his work has attracted among feminists and so-called essentialists are indeed justified. Yet in recognizing the flaws of his account, we have come only halfway to realizing the twofold dilemma that led Foucault to undertake his precarious foray into the domain of historical practices. Without his case for the sexual otherness of the Greeks, the narrative of his trilogy would have been far less persuasive. At the same time, his case of otherness, based on the logic of hierarchical penetrability, could only have been presented with reference to visible practices, since the relevant discursive constraints simply cannot be recovered from the ancient texts which he used. And on this note, we return to where we started, the objects used or abused as evidence of ancient sex. Foucault had clearly understood how important the evidence from painted pots had been to Dover. This much he acknowledged in his review of Dover's book, but when he came to writing his history of sexuality, he completely black-boxed the investigative process, mentioning the images in his own book only once as, I quote, certain iconographic representations, so as to prevent distraction from his polished narrative. In fact, his unease is still palpable in the review of Dover's book, where he states thus, and I'm translating here, the vast paintings are infinitely more explicit than the texts which have survived, including even comedy. But in return, many painted scenes remain silent, and they have indeed remained silent up to this point, without recourse to texts which reveal their value of love. If marginalization of materiality is commonplace in the institutional structures of academia, in this passage we witness its very ontological ramifications. For objects to be of any significance to the historian, they have to contain symbolic value that can be assimilated to text and read like a text. The historical truth of the image transpires from the refractions of overlaps between the two orders of discourse, textual and pictorial. Although this comparison of discourse with discourse is a lot more sophisticated than the distinctions between visual realism and fantasy with which many of Foucault's successors were preoccupied, the overall effect is not much different. For in replacing my implicit assumptions about what counts for realism in Greek images of sex for the discursive statements found in ancient texts, I simply end up substituting for the taxonomical presumptions of the modern archaeologist the discriminatory patterns of the ancient author. So instead of trying to recover the diversity of possible viewers and viewing situations of ancient art, we exchange the strictures of disciplinary vision for an imaginary Athenian community of interpretation, modelled on the hegemonic gaze of the male citizen. We could describe the move as a phenomenological fallacy. In order to understand ancient art as the ancients did, all we need to do, apparently, is to try to think like a Greek when we look at pots by replacing replicating the ideological alignments recovered from the textual tradition. Yet, a strong commitment to phenomenology entails that we can never see ancient art through ancient eyes. Rather than trying to attune our visual awareness to ancient visualities, a consistent approach requires us to invert the subject-object relation and focus on how the object shapes the moment of its being perceived. To illustrate what I mean, let us reflect on the sensuous objects mentioned in my title. Many previous histories of sexuality which have drawn on ancient art have done so more or less explicitly with the intention of establishing whether particular images of sex were meant to arouse or repel the viewer. The question seems particularly pressing when we try to establish how symposiasts were meant to respond to the famous Brugos Cup in the Ashmolean Museum, which you have here on screen. Whereas the museum records describe the subject still as a paedophile and victim, more recent publications on Greek pederasty, such as Alan Shapiro's contribution to the controversial volume Greek Love Reconsidered, tends to explain it as a celebration of the Greek cultural ideal, reciprocal love between same-sex and age-differential partners in an era ostensibly unencumbered by the modern hysteria surrounding child abuse. Was this Erastes just a devoted lover, or had he possibly forsaken his dignity, literally stooping down to attract the attention of a social inferior? Was the boy's behavior compatible with the pederastic ideal, or was his enthusiasm perhaps commercially motivated? Was the symposiast who discovered this image at the bottom of his wine cup upon draining it meant to be stimulated, amused, or perturbed? Many iconographical arguments can be brought to bear, none of them entirely conclusive. There is nothing inherently pejorative about the man's physiognomy, although his chest is slightly saggy, perhaps a sign that he is rather too old for what he's doing, or what he's seen doing here. The bag on the boy's shoulder is no doubt one of those gifts which pederastic couples can be seen exchanging in courtship scenes, the kinds of scenes we've seen earlier on. But if it contained gaming tokens, as it is usually suspected, did it not also bring to mind the money bags which men can be seen offering in other vast scenes to female or indeed male prostitutes? It's worth pausing here to stress what's at stake in the assumption that there is one correct reading of this pot, or indeed any other pot. Whether you accept the image as deviant or idealizing, by positing a single interpretation, we place the constitution of sexual desire in the mind of the viewer and give the mind priority over situational interaction and materialization. By the same token, the supposed queer readings in recent scholarship of pederastic images end up establishing a new, or paradoxically end up establishing a new norm, a sexual type existing prior to its bodily inscription. Images are marshalled to support claims with which they have no heuristic connection, and the objects on which the images appear are rendered invisible. What if we understand the sensuous object in a less predetermined way? That is, sensuous as relating to synesthetic involvement rather than titillation. To invert the subject-object relation in our case is to concentrate less on how the viewer might have seen the vase painting than on how the collaboration of object and image conditioned its possibilities of reception, the way the monument differs at the moment of recognition to create tension and response. The empirical basis for studying history of sexuality from ancient art issues not from the supposed realistic content of its representations, but from the cultural construction of that moment of suspense. So for the rest of this talk, I want to explore first, with further examples of ancient art, how this moment was constructed, and second, why the material process that supports that moment of experience has been suppressed in scholarship. And what could possibly be more convincing in testing my argument than to apply it to what is possibly the most important artwork in the political life of classical Athens. The statues of Harmodios and Aristogaton were dedicated by the Athenian demos to commemorate the assassination during a religious procession in 514 BC of Hipparchos, the son of the tyrant Pisistratos and the brother of his successor, Hippias. The monument was placed prominently in the agora and occupied a central role in the maintenance of Athenian civic identity, commemorating nothing less than the foundation of democracy. A first group by the sculptor Antenor appears to have been inaugurated soon after the Spartan expeditionary force had ousted the Pisistratic regime in 511 BC. And then a second group by Critias and Isotis, and that's the one which you see here and which is well known from Roman copies, was set up in 477 BC as a replacement of the group by Antenor, which had been carried off by the Persians during the sack of Athens. It was the first time that the Athenians chose to immortalize the achievements of mortals through a collectively sponsored statue dedication, a practice that would later proliferate in Greek city-states as a political bargaining tool in dealing with kings and ultimately with Roman emperors. The dynamic posture and compositional depth are hallmarks of the new sculptural style of the early classical period, first created quite possibly for this very monument. But despite its fame, much remains mysterious about the group. Why did the Athenians decide to commemorate this deed is questionable, given that the assassination of the tyrant marked neither the end of tyranny, a feat the Athenians actually owed to their arch rivals, the Spartans, nor did it mark the beginning of democracy, which was instituted by Cleisthenes a few years later. Furthermore, the historians Herodotus and Thucydides tell us that Harmodios and Aristogaton were motivated by jealousy rather than patriotism. Hipparchos had apparently made advances on Harmodios, which remained unrequited, but outraged Harmodios' older lover, Aristogaton. And you can see they're bearded and unbearded, beardless, to mark that difference in age. So why were the tyrant slayers memorialized as founders of the new political order? One answer comes from the way the statue group constitutes its viewer as a spectator complicit in its representation. A viewer complicit in Athens' paradigmatic representation of tyrannicide is one who momentarily suspends his judgment to buy into the dynamics of erotic attraction which the statues embodies. The passerby, becoming aware of the tyrannicides in their most dramatic frontal aspect, finds himself in the position of the tyrant under attack, and by stepping into that space of fiction, completes the narrative requirements of the group. Simultaneously, by crossing into the fictive realm, the viewer becomes aware of these sculpted bodies as potentially real bodies. By performing this metalepsis, the obviously male ideal viewer can also become a desiring viewer, competing as Hipparchus did with Aristogaton and Hermodius for Hermodius' attention, and in facing Aristogaton, becoming aware of the tyrannical implications of his desire. As Richard Neer has recently argued, the dialectic entailed in viewing the statue group instantiates the agonistic homoeroticism between the three men as a manifestation of the drive of collective Athenian citizen excellence. The suspense created by the statues derives its teleological power from the sculpture's imaginative staging of the moment as the assassins step out of the crowd, swords raised, to kill their tormentor. The viewer is meant to be startled for a moment, facing these gleaming bodies of polished bronze. The inscription on the base heightened that moment through its unusual composition. Surely a great light for the Athenians came into being when Aristogaton killed Hipparchus with Harmodius, and then there's a lacuna, they brought their fatherland freedom or equality. The reader has to scan the face of the stone twice before he is told at the very end of the second line that the great light experienced in the monument signified a new political order, freedom or equality, which are two possible restorations of the missing word in the inscription. And the two elegiac couplets, so these are the two verses engraved in two long lines, they form sort of a chiastic composition. The symbolic light A, and its denotated social politics, also A, sandwiching between them the human agents of deliverance, Aristogaton B and Harmodius B, with Hipparchus C between them, so to speak, in the crosshairs. In contrast to the schematic art of the archaic period, the figural compositions of the post-Persian War era, epitomized in the tyrannicides, appear to unfold in the same space-time continuum as that inhabited by the viewer. Where viewers of the preceding era had faced an inscrutable alterity in the sculpted other, the postures of classical figured art were structured around moments of supreme psychological tension, either before or after dramatic turning points. They coax the viewer into their virtual space of images by activating momentary recognitions and substitutions, a kind of a free play on the probability of self-identification between real and represented bodies. One compelling method of generating this mode of interactive viewing, as Niklaus Dietrich has recently stressed, is the intentional lacunae in the figure cast, so incompleteness demanding to be completed imaginatively by the viewer. In the case of the tyrannicides, the absence of Hipparchus encourages the viewer to become engaged by placing himself into the role of the desiring tyrant. So in assessing the relation of that viewer to the sculpted bodies of Harmodius and Aristogaton, one might be misled by the modern cliché of the celebrity so attractive that everyone, even admirers of the same sex, either wants to be like him or her, or have sex with him or her. But in Athenian images, roughly contemporary to the tyrannicides, the direction of desire was not inherent in the targeted marketing of the celebrity to the assumed sexuality of the viewer, but was essentially worked out in this act of viewing. We can trace the rise of this interactive image in the diversification of so-called love pursuit scenes, one of the most plentiful genre types in Athenian vase painting of the late archaic and early classical period. Broadly, they attest to shifts in popularity, from heroes pursuing women to gods pursuing mortals, and finally, youths pursuing women. Earlier examples can easily be seen to reflect, in the words of Eva Coyles, the principle of male domination by the means of sex. Andrew Stewart interpreted Peleus's capture of Thetis as empowering men in the subjugation of women, as it provided a metaphor for the passage of the woman from a wild to civilized creature through marriage. The reverse of women pursuing men, which is also sometimes the case, as for example in Eos chasing Tithonus or Kephalos, has been thought to signify that such transgression of the civilized order could only come about through divine intercession, confirming yet again the principle of male domination among mortals. But in the early 5th century BC, these kinds of pursuit scenes begin to explode the simple binary of dominant and dominated. They accomplish this feat by removing the paired figures further away from each other and simultaneously relating them more determinedly in pose and gesture, as well as narrative theme. The result is the early classical vases with isolated figures on opposing sides of the vessel's body, seemingly spotlit against their plain black background. The larger distance between the figures allows the vessel to raise the expectations of the viewer as their hands and gaze work their way around its body. This temporal deferral encourages the viewer to complete the narrative proleptically, and in so doing to transgress the boundaries between representation and imagination. Seeing Zeus on one side of the vessel in the conventional stance of the giant slayer, the viewer might not be overly surprised to find a woman being pursued on the other side of the vessel, as you have it in this example here. But when a similar pursued woman is paired with Athena as pursuer, the vessel intentionally sets up the viewer's expectations so as to leave him or her in a position where they have to complete for themselves the dynamics of pursuit. The aporetic situation is magnified in pieces in which the entire decoration features only a single figure. Is a fleeing woman on her own still necessarily being pursued, or is she pursuing? Is the isolated hunter who stops to look back becoming aware of a quarry to be pursued, or of an amorous pursuer pursuing him? Should we expect a male pursuer, or indeed a female one, as in this related cut fragment on the right here, showing the hand of Eos on the shoulder? You see it's exactly the same figure with a hand here. So showing the hand of Eos on the shoulder of Kephalos, or is the person pouring perfumed oil from the vessel herself to become the pursuer? To return to the problematic legacy of vase paintings in modern theories of sex, such images, as I've tried to show, fundamentally complicate the unidirectional grammar of active and passive desire which Dover extrapolated from the material. Most of the images which I've just highlighted are in fact not even included in the conventional collections of images upon which modern explorations of Greek love are based. To illustrate my point, where for Dover and his readers the Ganymede on one side of this bell crater by the Berlin painter, so it's a piece which you've seen at the very beginning, was always going to be part of a corpus of images in which the boy is pursued. In this case by Zeus, shown on the other side of the vessel, there the upper black and white picture. For the contemporary viewer, the question whether he or she wanted to see more in this image than a boy playing with his cock was essentially a matter which he or she had to work out for themselves in the act of interactive viewing. Unlike the modern viewer, prejudiced by the corpora assembled by various specialists, The ancient viewer was after all aware of many similar pots in which the figure on the front wasn't paired with an image on the back, pots which obviously haven't made it in the scholarly corpus of pederastic images. At the same time, the modern corpus includes a great number of so-called pederastic images which our notional viewer of the Berlin painter's crater would never have been able to see, because the corpus mixes arbitrarily images from different periods, perhaps as much as a century apart, and images which appeared on vessel shapes used in a very different context. The modern vase scholar perusing the corpus gets to see those images in a way ancient users of pottery would never have been able to, not only because the corpus is predetermined by its scholarly preoccupations. At a much deeper level, even the single object catalogue in this scholarly archive is, thanks to the reproductive methods of drawing and photography, rendered surveyable in a way it had never been in antiquity. And to conclude my talk, I want to have a brief look at this problem of mediation. It is a widely accepted truism that sort of two-dimensional reproductions were indispensable for the disciplinary formation of art history and archaeology. From the era of the early modern antiquarians, the specialist study of artifacts involved the exchange, collection, sorting, comparison, and publication of graphic products, from drawings and watercolors to mechanically produced engravings, tracings, and eventually photographs. In this process of mediation through reproduction, the three-dimensional material qualities of Greek art have been erased, the very qualities upon which the durational aspects of ancient experience rested. The temporal deferment which the process of interactive viewing depends is traded off against the demands of connoisseurial or taxonomical assessment. We can follow the process in reproductions of antiquarian volumes. Whereas early 16th century collectors still preferred their pots to be drawn in a pronounced naturalistic detail. You have a photograph and the 16th century drawing watercolor next to each other. The aspired objectivity extends in this example here from the shading, evoking the plasticity of the vessel, to the breaks in the fabric. You can see there the broken foot. In the 18th century, it became standard to unroll the painting from the pot, frame it like a picture, and consign information on the pot with the pot shape to a separate reference sheet featuring idealized contour drawings of a representative sample. In the study of Greek sculpture, the superior resolution of photography allowed archaeologists to examine intricate details of carving, distinguishing the work of the original artist from those of the Roman-era copyist and modern restorers, and hence to experience a historical panorama of Greek sculpture that would never have been accessible to the ancient eye. One mid-19th century pioneer, and that's Robert Macpherson, was one of those photographers who started making these catalogues of museum collections. So one of these pioneers of sculptural photography claimed to have used exposure times of up to 2 days in order to ensure that the diffuse daylight of the museum interior could penetrate the deepest grooves of the statue's carved surfaces and make them visible in the negative. His example brings out that photographic images, however short their exposures, do not provide records of punctuated instants but synchronic collocations of optical effects with temporal duration. Owing to this synthetic character, photographic prints cancel out the bodily movements required to perceive the same detail from the actual object they represent. Walking, glancing, stopping, focusing on details, reading inscriptions, and so on. The motions and sensory operations that transform, as we have seen in the Tyrannicides, the indifferent passerby into an engaged receiver. So visual reproduction is a precondition for the institutionalization and perpetuation of what Bourdieu called the love of art. the semiotic struggle between groups in which the victors are those who succeed in converting their tastes into assets that appear to be natural faculties. That is, that cultural capital that is unequally distributed and reproduced through schooling and cultural institutions. Reproductions allowed cultural capital in its primitive state of personal accumulation, as you find it, for instance, in one-to-one conversations with a knowledgeable friend, to be lifted out of its local context, commodified, hierarchically monopolized, and globally transmitted in the form, for instance, of academic qualifications that are sometimes, I should say, convertible into other academic assets. So my argument today has been that the modern love of art, with its objectified media of conversion, has had a pernicious impact on our ability to experience art in all its momentary modalities of surprise and ambiguity. By eliding the time it takes to experience an object in all its sensory complexity, the love of art permitted the unpredictable power of images of eros to be rescripted into definite narratives of seduction, consummation, power, and hierarchy. To say that Greek images of sex were ambiguous is not to say that they weren't unrelated to discourses of power, but unlike Foucault's model of inscription, in which bodies at times appear to be external to its construction, Greek viewing habits provide, as I would hold, a way into understanding bodily construction more sort of in Judith Butler's sense, a diffuse and active structuring of social experience without distinctions, orientations, or meanings existing intact before the moment of materialization. Thank you.